Happy Sunday, everybody, and happy Mother's Day. Hope you're all doing well. So, we're into week 4, at the end of week 4 of Aether Drift, and I've got 6 meta breakers this week. So if you're new to this series, my meta breakers are decks that were successfully piloted into Mythic with at least a 60% win rate and at least 50 games. And they're all off-meta picks, so you won't see any Azorius Omniscience here, and I did include a mono red variant this time around, but just to kind of talk about it really quick. So anyway, this one is, and this is kind of typical to what we see. Usually around week 3 or week 4 is when we start to see the control side of the meta kind of adapting to the aggro builds. And so I expect to see more control kind of coming down the pipeline here shortly. So this one was, give me my notes here. So this was Azorius Control by Leshrac, went 110 and 64 for a 63% win rate. And the other thing I like to do is just talk about some of the other things that we've seen happen in the archetype specifically. So I'll compare it to the one that I've seen the most common on the Untapped tracker. So this one's not running a copy of Seachrome Coast. It's dropped 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, so it's not really looking like it's going for a mill win. We've dropped 2 copies of the Elspeth Smite, still have 1 in the main. And then we have 2 less Restless Anchorages, which is the Azorius Manland. We have 2 less Meticulous Archive, which is the Azorius Surveil Land. And then we have 2 less 3 steps ahead, which is the Cancel that then can also create copies of the creatures that you have on the battlefield. Now, we also have 1 less Island, 2 less Soul Partitions. So this one's not running any Soul Partition. Soul Partition works a little bit better with the Jace the Perfected Mind, since you can downtick Jace for -4, and then Soul Partition it back so that you can then do -5, those sort of lines. And then we also have 2 less Hornlock Whales. Typically we see Hornlock Whale to help out against the aggro matchups like Mono Red. This one's running 2 less Deduce, and Deduce is a way that you can kind of punish people for playing around the counter spells. If they hold mana up or just pass their turn, then you can use Deduce to not waste the turn after holding up the counterspell. So Deduce is is a much loved inclusion in the archetype. And then we also have 4 copies of No More Lies have been dropped. So No More Lies is the Azorius counterspell that exiles the card unless they pay 3. And then we do see that they're bringing in a 3rd copy of the Temporary Lockdown. This helps out against like the Corey Steel Cutter deck, any of the go wide strategies. We've got the 2 copies of the Negate for Azorius Omniscience, being able to counter their Abuelo's Awakening. We've also got the Stone Brain, which works really well for Azorius Omniscience, being able to just remove Omniscience, and then they don't have any part of their combo left. We also have 1 Teresian Mindbreaker, and this way, like, there is a little bit of mill. There is a single Jace. So instead of having 3 copies, we still have a Jace, we still have the Teresian Mindbreaker, so the deck can win through a mill strategy. It's just not the primary. It's like plan B, right? And then we've got 1 copy of Rest in Peace, which gives us a little bit of graveyard hate. So you can see kind of like a spread of different tools against a lot of the meta strategies, right? So we've got like Stone Brain, the 2 negates, and the Rest in Peace for against Azorius Omniscience. And then we also have Authority of the Consuls, which affects the Corey Steel Cutter deck pretty well. And then we've got 4 copies of Stock Up. This one we see in some lists and some not in others. I think it's a pretty strong divination, the strongest one we've ever seen, really, and is a pretty common inclusion in the control archetypes. We also have 2 Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon. This one I have not seen a whole lot. This one's a very unique take. So this one basically being able to search for your Moraine River regions or your Runescale Stormbrood, which is another one that was included by this pilot that we don't typically see. But being able to actually cast the red side off of the Rainbow of the Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon. Curious to see how that one plays out. So if you play this one, let me know in the comments below if you like that little combination. And then we have 1 copy of the Mistrise Village, and we've seen this one kind of growing in popularity with Azorius Omniscience, just giving you basically the Cavern of Souls effect, but for spells in general, instead of just creature spells, to play around the rise in control that we're seeing on the ladder. So we also have 3 Dispelling Exiles, which is the new Quench from Tarkir Dragonstorm. If you have a dragon which you can behold either on the field or in your hand, then they have to pay 4. Otherwise, they have to pay 2. So, kind of, definitely a unique take on the Azorius Control build, and but clearly did the thing, was able to get into Mythic, and looks like a really fun deck. Oh, and I just wanted to mention that the community deck tech is still open and available for those who would like to submit their deck for critique on Tuesday. We were looking at YouTube members will get priority. I think we have had 1 submission by a YouTube member, so there's still 3 public slots available, if you will. And you can always become a YouTube member for as cheap as $2 a month or whatever to help support the channel. And I look forward to doing the community deck tech on Tuesday, but sadly I can't get to everybody's, so it's kind of a balance, if you will, right, between it being a paid service and being free. So this one's Orzhov Pixie by Coles82, went 63 and 31 for a 67% win rate. And again, just really quickly, what we typically see in Orzhov Pixie, this is leaning a little bit more towards the Sarah Paragon build, which was in last week's, or 2 weeks ago for the community deck tech. I know somebody was asking about how to build Sarah Paragon, so there should be some interest in the community for this one. But we're dropping 1 Concealed Courtyard, 2 Plains, a Swamp, and the 4 Caves of Kolios, so none of the Orzhov Painland. And we're dropping the 4 copies of Scroll Shift, and Scroll Shift allows you to kind of do more of the temporary lockdown build, where you're blinking, you're playing your Hopeless Nightmares, wiping them with the temporary lockdown, and then bouncing the temporary lockdown so you get a repeat of the Hopeless Nightmare and Momentum Breaker. So this one's leaning a little bit further away from the blink effect, and is also dropping the 4 copies of Nowhere to Run, which is the -3/-3 enchantment that gets around Hexproof and Ward. And then we've got 4 less on the Corroding Dragonstorm, which is the black enchantment that drains for 2 and triggers a Surveil. I think it actually Surveil 2. And then the Clayfired Bricks as well, which helps you kind of smooth out your mana curve and then gives you a late game win condition. And instead, we see that they're bringing in the 2 copies of Liliana the Veil. This one allows you to hate on their hand, but also gives you something that isn't affected by the temporary lockdown. And then we have the 3 copies of the Sarah Paragon, which allows us to play anything that's 3 or less. So allows us to play everything except for Beza and the Overlord of the Baelmerg. And this one's also running a single copy of Fountain Port, which can work okay in the archetype. It's not amazing, but gives you a little bit of late game if it comes down to that. And then we've got the 3 copies of the Overlord of the Baelmerg, which allows us to mill some of the stuff back, like similar to how the Sarah Paragon is replaying things from our graveyard. And then we've got 2 copies of the Soulstone Sanctuary. And this also just gives us an alternative strategy if they're able to shut down our... if they're able to interact and shut down our temporary lockdown loops and our Sarah Paragon loops, then we can win the game, hopefully, through a manland. All right, number 3 here. And again, this is not done in any particular order. I just kind of pick them out throughout the weeks. They're all publicly available on Untapped. Boros Red by Angel of Shivan went 109 and 72 for a 60% win rate. This is basically a mono red build, but technically it is not. It is slightly different, right? Because we're ditching the strictly mono red to bring in Sheltered by Ghosts. So we're dropping 1 Lightning Strike, we're dropping 1 copy of the Rockface Village, and we're dropping 8 Mountains and the 3 Witchstalker Frenzies to bring in the white fixing, so 4 Battlefield Forward, 4 Inspired Vantage, and 1 Sun Billow Verge, and the 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it is basically like mono red. Just really quickly, though, it does change the matchups a little bit. It helps out against the mirror match, where the lifelink off of the Sheltered by Ghosts is relevant, and then makes the deck a little bit more prone to losing to mono black and Esper Pixies, where they can get a more reliable 2-for-1 when you go to play the Sheltered by Ghosts. All right, now this one is a truly new archetype. This one, I've had my eyes on it, especially since we got some very good new tools for the discard strategy. So this one's Boros Monument by Hasakura, went 163 for a 61% win rate. And I really like the way that they approach this. So it's sort of like the red-white side of Jeskai Oculus without leaning into the Oculus, right? So we've got the Tursa Light Shatter, the Fear of Missing Out, the Scrapwork Mutt, that all allow us to be able to discard. And then we have the obviously it's built around the Monument to Endurance, being able to give every time that you discard a card, you do one, either draw a card, create a treasure token, or your opponent loses 3 life. And this is not going for very much of a control shell, it's much more aggressive, right? And so we've got like Guardian of New Benalia, which can be this indestructible creature that also triggers you a discard trigger for your Monument to Endurance. We've got Torch the Tower for interaction along with Burst Lightning. 1 copy of the Helping Hand and 4 copies of the Recommission to bring back cards that we are discarding. And 1 copy of Get Lost for some enchantment hate and planeswalker hate. Sheltered by Ghosts for stabilization against mono red. And then we've got the Screaming Nemesis, which really punishes damage-based removal in mono red as well. And then the Phyrexian Dragon Engine is another one that discards your hand as a way to trigger the Monument to Endurance, but then also gives you something that's good to discard because you can then unearth it from the graveyard. So really interesting approach. I'm really excited to try this one out. I also found a really interesting Jeskai Control list for you guys. And this one was by Insys12, was 64 and 42 for a 60% win rate into Mythic. And so Jeskai Control has definitely popped up onto the scene now. More people are exploring it, especially after its performance in the regional championship in Minneapolis, where I think it took down, it was in the top 4, right? We talked about it a couple weeks ago. Anyway, so the Jeskai Control builds are moving a little bit further away from the Jeskai Revelation and more into just bringing in Shiko and Lightning Strike as the only red. This one is also including a Braid and Rediscover the Way. So let's talk about it a little bit. So we've tweaked the lands, so we dropped 1 Elegant Parlor, which is the Boros Surveil land. We dropped a single Beza copy, which is a double pip white. Can be a little bit hard if we're going to bring in more red. We dropped a River Pyre Verge, which is the Izzet Verge land, and we've also dropped 2 islands and Chandra Beacon of Hope, or sorry, Chandra's Hope's Beacon, which was being explored in this archetype, same along with the Ill-Timed Explosion. So some versions are bringing in more red than what we saw in the best of 3. This is more towards the best of 3. And then we're also dropping the 2 copies of Torch the Tower and the 2 copies of Jeskai Revelation. And instead we're bringing in 2 additional copies of the Fabled Passage, bringing in a 4th copy of the Temporary Lockdown. Again, helps out against the Corey Steelcutter deck. 1 copy of Stroke of Midnight I really like, because this is a card that can be hit along with the Rediscover the Way off of Shiko. This gives you a little bit more flexibility in what you can use. Also, this is able to destroy any non-land permanent, so it's good for removing problematic threats that aren't necessarily creatures, right? So, you know, Azorius Omniscience comes to mind, right? We also have an additional copy of Get Lost, 1 additional copy of Meticulous Archive, which is the Azorius Surveil land, 1 additional copy of the 3 Steps Ahead, 2 copies of Ghost Vacuum, which helps out against the Azorius Omniscience decks, and then 1 additional copy of the Meringue River Regent. Sometimes we see this at 1 copy, sometimes we see this at 4. We're still trying to kind of figure out the ideal amount of how heavily to lean into the Meringue. And then we also have 1 copy of the Corey, 1 additional copy of the Corey Mountain Monastery, which is a utility land that we got in Tarkir that allows you to gives you dig later in the game. You can tap 3 and a red and itself to exile the top card of your library, and then you can play it until your next turn. So this deck has some surprising grind to it. Definitely doesn't need to have the mill condition. In general, though, just so you know, in case you're new, Jeskai Control tends to be weaker against other pure controlled builds that have more counterspells, and does better against the creature-based strategies like Mono Red than Azorius Controlled. Alright, and the last one that I want to talk about this week is Azorius Artifacts. So, back-to-back, okay. So, week 1, I talked about Azorius Artifacts in the top 8, said craft with care because it quickly dropped out of the top 8. Since then, though, we saw in week 3 and in week 4 people successfully piloting Azorius Artifacts into Mythic. So the archetype is right on the border, right? It is one that you may bump into on your ladder climb, and you can successfully pilot it to Mythic. So this one was done by some symbols, which I think is Hyamin, according to Google. So this is Azorius Artifacts went 39 and 24 for a 62% win rate. And we're still seeing innovation in this archetype, trying to figure it out, right? So this one has dropped 3 Assimilation Aegis. I think the one last week dropped all 4 copies, but so we're seeing leaning further away from the Assimilation Aegis, and this one's also dropping 1 Perilous Snare, and dropping 2 of the Solemn Simulacrums. And the Solemn Simulacrums are the 2/2s that draw your land. We're dropping the Restless Anchorage, which is the ban land in Azorius. We're also dropping 2 Meticulous Archives, which is the Surveil land. We're dropping the Fomori Vaults, which allow you to look for artifacts, give you dig. And we're also dropping 2 copies of the Fountain Port. We're leaning further away from the Sweeper, so we have all 4 copies of the Temporary Lockdown have been wiped as well. And then Nexus of Becoming and the Riptide Gear Hulk that we talked about in week 1 kind of lets you continue stepping up the ladder with the Repurposing Bay if you want to. So sometimes we see those included in alternative builds. This one, we've got the A Darker Wastes, the Painland coming in here. We've got 3 copies of the Soul Guide Lantern. And this is something that if you're having troubles with Azorius Omniscience, definitely lean into the Soul Guide Lantern, right? Because you can cycle it away for 2 mana, so it's not necessarily a dead card, and then it allows you to... It's a good best of 1 inclusion, right? Whereas like the Ghost Vacuum and the Rest in Peace are better in best of 3. Soul Guide Lantern, they can destroy it with the Blast Zone. They can also draw into a Temporary Lockdown, so like it by no means wins you the game outright against Azorius Omniscience, but it does increase... It makes it much harder for your Azorius Omniscience player. So bringing that in as a tech against Azorius Omniscience, I can highly recommend for pretty much across the board, as long as you aren't in aggro, right? If you're in aggro, just try to race them straight out. We also have 1 Realm Breaker here, which is a way to kind of win against milling out our opponent. If we get into a really grindy matchup, like against Jeskai Control. And then we also have 2 Market Gnomes, and I've explored the Market Gnome. It kind of depends on like how much you want to lean into cycling upwards. So the other thing that's nice about the Soul Guide Lantern and the Ghost Vacuum to some extent in this archetype as well is that you can use the Repurposing Bay to use it to march on up to get to additional copies of your Simulacrum Synthesizer. So we've talked about that before too, that this archetype even gets a little bit better value out of the Soul Guide Lantern than usual. We also have 4 of the Lodestone Needles, and this is one that we've seen, if you go way back into like Lost Caverns of Ixalan, was explored, kind of dropped for other artifacts, but has the synergies with the Repurposing Bay and allows us to kind of slow down our aggro matchups in best of 1. So I think it's an interesting inclusion. I'm curious to see how it plays. We also have 2 additional copies of the 3 Steps Ahead. I think this is a nod to being able to protect our big board from wraths, since you've got the Depopulate and Wrath of God, and what was it actually called? Sunfall on 5, right? So 3 Steps Ahead helps out with that. You can also use it to copy additional copies, make additional copies of the Simulacrum Synthesizer. So you can have like almost feels like 10 copies in this deck. This one's also running the United Battlefront, so like 14 copies of the Simulacrum Synthesizer. And this is the card that I think really makes the Azorius Artifact build more of a possible build. So I still haven't really gotten to play around too much personally in the Azorius Artifact space, but there is something really cool there. And I imagine that we will eventually see a more highly competitive build kind of precipitate out at the end of Tarkir. So it's definitely something to keep your eyes on as we approach into rotations, actually not that far away. We're looking at September or August, or is it one of these years we're actually skipping it? I think it's next year that we're skipping all the way until January 2027. But anyway, I'll keep you guys all posted on that as we get closer to that. And so this one's running Day of Judgment as the Wrath, and then 2 additional islands. So, as always, thanks for listening to my ramblings. If you like this sort of thing every week, do consider becoming a YouTube member. It's the best way to help support me and the best way to say thank you for all the time and energy that I put into this. I do enjoy where Standard is. It's not the most popular opinion. There are a lot of people who think that Standard is in a terrible place. I think it's in a really good place, showcased by the variety of Jeskai builds that we have right now. And I hope you all are well on this Mother's Day. I hope your family is well. I hope those you care for are well. And I will be on tomorrow to talk about the best of 1, best of 3 meta review in week 5 of Tarkir. Kind of what's happening in best of 1 and what's happening in the best of 3 scene on Magic the Gathering Online. So, and then on Tuesday, like I mentioned, we'll be doing the community deck tech. And then I've got to kind of start wrapping things up for Tarkir. I usually would aim to do my pre-release guide on the May 30th, I think. But the problem with that is I won't be able to do it this time around, so I may not actually be able to do the pre-release guide for Final Fantasy. We will see. I may have to skip this one. But take care, everybody, and I will catch you all tomorrow.